Okay, I'm going to try and do this. There were a couple of people that wanted to understand how these clamps are used. I bought these from Separator.de. They're out of Europe, and these particular clamps, they're changeable. You can arrange the needles in any arrangement that you so choose to either transfer to the side, or with two clamps you can transfer onto the needles and use a second clamp to clamp the needles and then transfer it onto your ribber, or vice versa. Either way, it will transfer in either direction because you're transferring it from one clamp to another just like you would from hand to hand if you were using a single double-eyed needle. And that's all that these are, is a double-eyed needle. They are hanging on little hooks in here, and therefore you can arrange them in any arrangement you want for whatever pattern you're using, or randomly, however you so choose to do them. The needles themselves are not perfectly straight. The plates, however, are. And I'm going to have to spend a little bit of time straightening and marking these needles for which groupings and which direction they need to be the straightest they can be. I've only had this for less than 24 hours, so I'm definitely not an expert. I started out just doing some rib. I transferred the rib to the main bed, and then I started working on transferring back and forth between the beds, doing a garter stitch, and just for practice. Now that was last night. This morning I'm going to try and continue that and show you how to transfer from one bed to another using both clamps. The procedure is actually pretty simple. I'm just not coordinated really well with this. It takes a little bit of practice to coordinate both clamps, and I'm still learning, so bear with me. It's actually relatively easy to do. It just takes me a little bit of time to get from one to the other and coordinate my hands. So let me get set up and I will show you how I've been using this. We'll also try to keep my arm out of the camera. First, I'm going to set up by making sure that all of my latches are out of the way and open. Then first scenario is to get all of the loops onto all of the needles. It's really nice when you're transferring from the ribber to the main bed because it holds the clamp for you, which is super nice. Now, this is where the coordination is needed and practice. I would assume. Hey! I got them all in the clamp the very first time. Remove the other clamp. And from there, rock down into my open needles. Which I then bring forward and simply rock the clamp up. Very end one, like normal. There, done. Didn't drop a single one. All of them are now in place. I don't know if you can see that on the camera or not. From there, I simply go to the very next batch. They're all in. All the loops are now on the needles in the clamp. There is a tiny amount of leeway, and I'm probably going to deal with that by taking some aquarium tubing, splitting it, and putting it underneath the angled part of the clamp so that it will individually hold them, and it will have a little bit of a rubberization effect to keep them from sliding back and forth. That's approximately 1 millimeter when it's doing that. From there, again, did I get them out? I think I did. Woohoo! Alright, everybody is in a needle again. Bring them out. Tilt up. Beep, 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 beep. Oh, and I did finally drop the very first stitch. Well, that's interesting. That's the very first time I've done that. Okay. Now, since this was garter stitch, it would go back and forth, and I will fix that later, because I do actually happen to have the seed stitch tool. So all I'm going to do is catch this up. Okay. And from there, I will end up taking a marker and sticking it in that row. From there, my fault, I wasn't watching. Okay, all of those are on. So I go to the next batch. They're all in there. What did I do with my... There it is. Sorry. I laid it down where I shouldn't have laid it down. Okay. Transfer in. They're all on there. Got one behind my little indicator. Off the needles. And sitting. Grab the other clamp. I really like the transfer from the rubber to the main bed because it holds it. And that is so nice. The second clamp is off. They're all in hooks. Tilt up. All those are in. Done. And at the end down here, all those. To do the next row of garter stitch, all that you need to do is simply knit across, and then you just transfer back. If I'd been watching, I wouldn't have dropped one, but that's the very first stitch that I've dropped after transferring. I believe I'm up to 9 complete transfers so far, and that's the very first stitch that I've actually dropped, and it's that simple. Let me see if I can let the rubber down and show you the progress I've done just in playing with it. So I started off with 1x1 rib, and then I transferred and started doing garter stitch. So I have 1 row, 2 rows, 3 rows, and the very first row I had to transfer from the ribber to the main bed, and that was an every other stitch transfer. So that's actually working very nicely and seems to work pretty simple. My main issue is coordinating between my hands and the clamps, and making sure that I don't squeeze the clamps accidentally, although that's actually pretty hard to do. These clamps are actually pretty stiff. They've got a pretty substantial spring in here, and they are very hard to pull open, and it's actually quite easy if I just remember to hold from one side when I'm handling the clamps instead of holding both. Then I don't have to worry about accidentally squeezing it. And it doesn't take but just a tiny squeeze to let these guys get loose. You can actually see just how easily they'll move around in there if they have any play at all. But once they're in the plate and they're held securely by the clamp, they're not going anywhere. They're pretty stiff in there. But this is a straight metal edge, so any variation in the diameter gives them just a little bit of leeway to slide back, and that's because of the actual variance that it allows them with the angle of the hooks in there. See, and because the eye is elongated, it does allow them to slip back and forth just a little bit. So I think a rubberized edge would actually make them hold a little better and keep them from rubbing or slipping back and forth for the length of that needle. But they're actually quite well made. They're quite heavy duty. These are the 4.5 set of clamps. Let me show you really quickly what the actual clamps look like in set, the plates. The clamps themselves can be used with any of the different size plates. They sell multiple different size plates. They just simply screw on, and you need one plate for each clamp that you have. You can buy just the plates. So if you have a set of clamps, you can buy plates for whatever size machines you have, and you don't have to buy them all at one time. You can buy a single clamp and use it on a single bed machine, or to do single bed patterns. A set of clamps, I'm going to show you the 9mm plates here. The plates for the 9mm, the plates actually have 3 parts. It has the hooks, which allow you to hang the needles on them, and that holds the needles whenever you're hanging them or arranging them into whatever pattern that you're wanting to work in. And that goes into a heavy duty, this thing is pretty thick and pretty heavy, plate that the hooks slide through, and then the needle separator plate goes between those, and it provides grooves for the needles to sit in, to be spaced at the exact spacing they need to be according to whatever size plate you're using. you do have to have 2 plates if you have 2 clamps to be able to transfer them back and forth, and that's the hard part, is holding that clamp open, because it's pretty tight, and you'll end up, my hand ends up jigging pretty good whenever I'm not coordinating well, or I'm not seeing it well, and being able to get these little hooks into the eyes of the needles. Although I did make one transfer where I had two double-ended needles that didn't get put into the new hooks on the other clamp, and the transfer still went okay. I just had to take it really slow and be careful with it. But I ended up buying multiple plates, and I saved up for them for quite a while so that I could just get them at one time. But I could just as easily have bought the first set and then slowly added to the sets for the different machines that I own. These, I think, are going to do everything that I want them to do, and they're quite useful, and they've got quite a future ahead of them in use for me. I really like these. And since I have multiple size machines, I decided I wanted to have a set for each one of them so that I could use the same equipment and the same techniques on every single machine. So I bought multiple plates, one for each different gauge machine I have. For this little guy here, I think I have one. Yep, there he is right there. For this, I would just end up transferring back and forth between the 2 different hooks. You know, a stitch faced forward, a stitch faced backwards, a stitch faced forward, and a stitch faced backwards until I came all the way up the row. And it's not actually hard to do, but with the rubber comb on, I find it much more difficult. I'd end up having to remove the rubber comb to be able to actually do that. I will see if I can get that done, but I will probably do that for a different video. Thank you very much.